Welcome to the latest in our debates on media in transformation here at Middlesex University, London. The agenda is quite simple: to help students develop critical thinking skills, but also to explore what's needed in terms of the skill set to make great television. Tonight we're joined by Hugh Muir, a columnist at The Guardian and a man with over a quarter of a century's experience of dealing with the gritty reality of life in Britain. Good evening, everyone. Thanks very much for coming along to our third in the series of media in transformation debates. We thought after the first two we needed to add a bit of glamour, so we introduced you to Georgiana Tudor, who is our glamorous co-chair this evening. We have the great pleasure of having Hugh Muir as an old friend of mine. We've been in the business more or less the same length of time, although he of course looks at least 10 years younger, which suggests something about the difference between broadcast and print. Hugh started in journalism in local newspapers, a traditional print pathway, and he's worked on all of the interesting national newspapers like the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph, Evening Standard, and now of course The Guardian. Well, a lot of people don't remember that he was a BBC correspondent for some time. And he decided that that wasn't the life he wanted, so went back to print. And he's now seen as The Guardian's watchdog, really, on the stories of the day. He's got a prodigious output as The Guardian's diary editor, on his column, of course, which is called Hideously Diverse Britain. But he also writes extensively on race, social policy, policing, and London government. Now, one of the things, Hugh, we've been talking to people about right from the beginning is that many students think it's tougher now to start in journalism than when we were young whippersnappers. But of course, you still need the same motivation, you still need the same inspiration, you still need the same determination to start. Give us an idea of where you started and what drew you to journalism. You know, given that we had a wide canvas, we could have gone into anything, couldn't we?
Do you know, I think that journalism and the people go into it, there's a match in terms of personality. I think in a way you gravitate towards it, and perhaps when you think about it later you think, I couldn't really have done anything else. I started off at school knowing that it wasn't going to be maths, because my maths was awful, but I always liked to read and I always liked writing. And so I thought, well, maybe it'll be something with the written word or the spoken word. I was really keen to go into radio initially. And I remember writing to the then BBC Radio London to a guy called Alex Pascal, who did a programme on BBC London called Black Londoners, and saying, look, I'd love to go into radio, how do I do it? And he said, come up and see what we do. So I went up and saw him do a programme, loved it, and said to him afterwards, I want to do that, how do I do it? And he said, whoa, hang on. You've got to train as a journalist first. You don't just pitch up and say, hi, I'm on the radio. So you've got to train properly. Go to a local paper. And I was at school then, so back to school I went. And I then got lucky because a classmate had decided she wanted to go into journalism as well. And so we actually, one afternoon, the school were dragging their feet, doing anything about it careers-wise, and so we bunked off one afternoon. She called the Barking and Dagenham Post and said, could we come and see? And the access was great. I mean, you know, getting to BBC London just like that, very easy. And the Barking and Dagenham Post just said, come up and see what we do. So they sent me out with a reporter on a really mundane story. And it was about a woman and her husband, and they married quite late, so they had 2 council properties. They decided they should have 1 council property, and they rang the paper and said, council have been really horrible to us, we've got no things, we've got no money, they're being horrible. Come and write a story. So I went with this reporter, who you might know, called Martha Clark, who used to work on BBC. I think she used to work on ITV as well. And we went out to see this woman. And the first thing we noticed was in the middle of the room, there was this huge mountain of that was covered by a blanket. And we didn't know what was there, but of course we didn't want to ask either. And she clearly didn't want to tell us. We did half the interview with her saying how she didn't have anything, any possessions, and the council really need to do better by her. And then she said, do you want to have a cup of coffee? And we said, oh, that'd be nice. And she went out, and as soon as she went out, Martha went over to the mountain and lifted the blanket. And there were all these valuables under there. And she'd basically just gone around, and everything that she had of any value, she'd just hidden in the middle in the hope we wouldn't see it, and she'd be able to peddle this story about how she had no money. And so when she came back, Martha left it a couple of minutes and said to her, you know you've got no money and no things, about all that stuff under there. And the woman went bananas. She went absolutely berserk. How dare you look at that? How dare you come in here and lift this blanket and look at my things? Get out, get out, get out. And so she actually, God knows where the strength came from, but suddenly she found this superhuman strength, and she tried to bundle us out of her flat. And she slammed the door, and Martha thought, but I was told to come back with this story. We better get back in. So she knocked the door again, and I can't remember what she said. I mean, just this stream of words, but it was so persuasive that if she hadn't been a journalist, she could have gone into selling double glazing. But the woman let her back in. And we sat there and we got the story. And afterwards, I just thought, this job's mad. I like this. I'm going to do this. And so just on the back of this kind of crazy afternoon at the Barking and Dagenham Post, I wrote to my local paper and said, I go to a school locally, I'd like to be a journalist. They said, go to college. So I did my A-levels, didn't go to university, went straight to journalism college, and then got very lucky. Wrote to my local paper again, said I've done the course, and just so happened they had a job. And so I ended up as the apprentice on my local paper.
It's great to hear all these initial experiences you had with journalism. Would you like to tell us more? What did journalism college do for you? And when did you really feel that you become a journalist?
I think that the thing that I really remember from journalism college, the thing I remember every day from journalism college, actually two things I remember every day, given the job I do now. One is the shorthand, because I had no aptitude for it whatsoever, and it was a real struggle. I just about got my 120 words a minute. But in terms of the kind of determination that you have, you need to know that I failed the first proficiency test I did 3 out of 4 parts, and had to go back and retake it. So the shorthand, I really remember, and because I write a column that every day could land us in court and doesn't, and touch wood, is this wood? Won't, 5.5 years and we've not ended up in court yet. I remember the law. And it's not that I remember all the details of the law, but I know when there's trouble and I know when to take advice. So that's mainly what I remember from college. But the other thing I remember from college, and my local paper was also a good continuation, was that just the afternoons when they kicked us out of the office and just said, find a story. Because on the local paper I trained on, we would go to press on Tuesday night and print first thing Wednesday morning and be in the shops on Wednesday afternoon. And so come 7 o'clock Tuesday night, the editor would say, so what have we got for the front page? And the news editor would then go with the copy paper that we'd been typing our stories on a typewriter. And he would say, this is our front page. And the editor would look at it and say, no, it isn't. And he'd rip it up. And he'd go back in his office and say, call me out when you've got a story that we're going to put on our front page. And we would have to sit there until we had one. And we could be there at 10:30, 11 o'clock at night. We were just there until you got a story that the editor considered as being worthy of putting on the front page. So that was the other thing I learned from college. You know, I've heard it described as the tyranny of the empty page. There is a danger that reporters go into journalism and they think that their job is to process information. Their job is to find information and all that goes with that. And so then you need the ability to recognise what's an interesting fact, the ability to get on with people, the ability to develop a relationship with people so they will confide in you and maybe tell you things that they shouldn't. And I consider that a lot of that came from the disciplines that we had at college.
Because a lot of journalists are journeymen, aren't they? And not all journalists become stars. And there's all the glamour of the foreign correspondent and the big commentators. And some people say, well, what's left for everyone else? Because they take all the juicy bits. What did you set yourself a target of when you became a journalist? Did you just want to be an eyewitness to history? Just want to tell stories? Or did you say, I'm going to carve out a niche and somehow change the world?
I've never quite worked like that, but the lucky thing about the local paper I trained on, it was a really hard newspaper. So when I was at college, during the holiday periods, we'd go to a local paper, and everyone would go to their local paper. And then when we came back, we'd go round the room and say, what did you do? And they'd say, oh, I was at a garden fete. And what did you do? I went to a health authority meeting. And they'd get to me, because I was covering Newham and West Ham, and I'd say, oh, I did a triple axe murder. I had to go to this post office because it had just been robbed with a sawn-off shotgun. And so it was a really kind of, almost a bloodthirsty area. And so I came out of it with a really good hard news training that allowed me to miss out the local paper, the regional paper stage. Most people go from local papers to regional papers to national papers. I went straight from the Newham Recorder to the Mail on Sunday. And it wasn't that much of a transition because of the hard news training. So after I was almost the trainee on the Mail on Sunday for a while, and after a couple of years, I became the foreign fireman, as we call it. If there was anything happened on a Friday night, I had my bag packed and off I went, including when Ceausescu fled Romania. I covered the first Gulf War for the Mail on Sunday. And so I was really into news. But I always found as well that I liked to write. And so I almost morphed into the position I have now, which is almost news but written news writing. And so I tend to straddle features and news. But that's just because I have a style. Some reporters just write hard news, and they just there isn't much in terms of an individual style to it. But I always had an individual style, and so I almost drifted into that kind of journalism.
That leads very well into my next question. You've recently tweeted an article you wrote on multiculturalism using the words "my hideously diverse Britain" column.
Okay.
Now, for our audience that might not be familiar with your column, would you like to explain why did you make that choice of words?
Do you know we're beginning to have a problem with the title of that column because it's 2-3 years old now, and when we launched it, the thinking was, actually someone said to me, would you like to write a column about hideously racist Britain? And I said no, because it isn't. But it is hideously diverse, to use your phrase. And where the phrase came from was the Director General of the BBC, two back, was Greg Dyke. And he surveyed what he saw as he went around the BBC buildings. And he said that he felt that the BBC was hideously white. And so we thought it was quite a nice play on words. And while people had that in mind, it was quite a nice play on words. But now that some people have forgotten where it came from, occasionally you'll get a message saying, what's wrong with diversity? Why do you think diversity is hideous? I mean, it was just a way of saying the country is changing, and it's not just changing because there is one block of people. It's changing in ways that we haven't really begun to understand, even within the way we cover it in the media. There are lots of different groups now, and we kind of need to get our heads around the way of reporting what is almost a mosaic in society now. You have so many different groups with different cultures from different backgrounds, and so it's meant to, in quite an affectionate way. And the column was meant to be really quite positive, but we may at some point have to look at the title again.
Part of your craft, obviously, as a journalist is immersing yourself in the story. You see that in the way you write. I wonder about impartiality, because unlike BBC journalists, where we've got straitjacketed to be impartial on everything, as a Guardian journalist, you're much freer to wear your heart on your sleeve, aren't you?
The facts have to be right. Sorry, the BBC is a very particular case. And I went to the BBC from the Daily Telegraph. It was a strange route because I'd been at the Mail on Sunday, not the Daily Mail. I was at the Mail on Sunday, which was a very different a different organ then, which I'll talk about if you like. But I went from Daily Mail to the Daily Telegraph, and at the Mail on Sunday you were able to have certain opinions. I mean, it was in some ways quite a preachy paper. It was a Sunday paper, and we took very strong positions on things. I did a series on army discrimination at the Mail on Sunday. And that came about because I did one story about a black soldier who'd gone absent without leave. And at the end of that story, we actually took him back. He wanted to go back, having been absent for a while, he wanted to go back to the barracks. The army actually tried to raid his house and capture him before he gave himself up. And we found ourselves bundling him into the boot of our car to get him off the estate so he could actually give himself up, because if they'd captured him, they would have put him in the guardhouse for something like 10 more weeks. It was much more severe if they were able to say he ran and we've had to catch him. And by then, we felt that, that he was in a way our responsibility. And so we actually smuggled him off the estate and put him into our car. And so you had almost a different kind of investment when I was on the Mail. And then I went to the Telegraph, which was very different to the Telegraph now. The Telegraph now is quite opinionated, in the same way as the Daily Mail was opinionated. When I joined, it was edited by Max Hastings, and it had this long-held tradition that there was no opinion in the news at all. Now, with hindsight, you look at that and you know that the way they voiced their opinion was the stories they put in and the stories that they chose not to put in. But if a story was in, the reporter didn't put any of themselves in that story. You just reported facts. And so that was a strange transition, and I spent the first few weeks with subs just taking phrases out that I put in, because I was writing like I was on the Mail on Sunday, and so there was bits of me. And I went from the Telegraph to the BBC. And that was another change, because the Telegraph thought they were fairly strict, but the BBC was even more strict, because as you know, you say anything, there's going to be someone who will object to it and say, I disagree with what you've said, and you have no right to thrust an opinion down my throat, because I pay for you, I pay the licence fee, and I don't expect that from you. So for a while that was quite tricky, being at the BBC and again having to completely take all opinion from your pieces. On the Diary it's different, because the column I write now is news-based, fact-based, but it's on the opinion page and it has my name on it. Not just as a byline, but it's Hugh Muir's diary. And so I suppose I inhabit this hinterland now where I'm able to put those facts in, but to put an interpretation on them. And so long as that interpretation doesn't take us down to the High Court, then that's allowed. In fact, that's one of the key ingredients of the column.
Actually has some
that leads very
observations
well.
on
What do you make of this whole scandal around Eastern European immigration? I mean, what about this extensive media coverage given to political parties like UKIP? Is there a danger that this alters the public opinion on matters of immigration and equality?
Eventually. The coverage taken together can be pretty corrosive. And I think that we all have a duty of care. We have to report the news, and if people are worried, then I think you have to reflect that. But you do have to be responsible as well. I wrote my hideously diverse column 2 weeks ago. I think I went to the Romanian Cultural Centre and spoke to a guy there who just said, well, whoa, we don't know how many are going to come from Romania. If you, in terms of language, it may well be that not many will come here at all. We start from this first principle that everyone just wakes up, lives and dreams with the possibility that they might get to Britain, but a lot of Romanians would rather go to countries where the language is more easily transferable, so they may end up in Spain or Italy, because actually in terms of that transit, that's an easier transition. And I just think it would be good if we were able to reflect better that sort of nuance and just to be a little less hysterical. But look, certainly in terms of print newspapers and tabloid newspapers, the last thing they want is for you to buy their newspaper and to not have a reaction at all. because why would you buy it the next week or the next day? So, every day they want you to buy that paper and to feel as if you've had a connection in some way with that newspaper. Something's moved you. Either it's made you laugh, or it's made you angry, or it's made you a bit scared. And the fear of the other is one of those components. It always works. And so you get the sense with some newspapers that they feel there always must be a group. And all you can do, which is precisely the conversation I was having at the Romanian Cultural Centre, is almost batten down the hatches, try and mitigate the effects of it as much as you can, and wait until the bandwagon moves on to someone else, which it will.
So you think, I mean, in the sea of patterns that you're talking about, I think it's fair to say you're not quite the traditional newsman. So you write fearless political commentary on specific interests that you have on unfair decisions and practices of the current administration.
And the last one.
I mean, yeah. I mean, The Guardian describes you as casting an irreverent eye over the stories of the day and follow them to places other journalists fear to tread. Do you really see yourself as a modern-day muckraker?
I didn't really. Actually, someone did tweet muckraker Muir the other day, and it was actually someone from the BNP, and so I took that. I was going to have a badge made. I'm going to ring him and say, "Thank you, sir." I think it's good. I try, even if I'm being humorous and gentle, to point out if someone has said one thing and done something else, if what they say and what they do doesn't tally, or if people have lied, because I think that's good journalism. And I think the lucky thing with the diary is that it does seem to me that over the years, just the number of issues that we deal with and the number of stories that we write about have almost shrunk. It's almost as if we're a pack of greyhounds chasing the same hare. And so I've tried to do things slightly differently and to introduce some subjects that just wouldn't necessarily get written about, or cases that wouldn't necessarily get written about. And so I think it's a really good opportunity. In all this following stories in places that others would fear to tread, I didn't write that. But I hope it's complementary. I hope that it adds something. Certainly within our paper, I like to think that I'm not just following the same stories as everyone else. Or if an issue that I've covered has also been covered elsewhere in the paper, I'm hoping that what I've done it in a way that's tangential enough to give new information, because I think it's a matter of adding value, and I try in the column to add value. So I mean, in a way, the whole reason for the column is to add value, because I'm on the comment pages, and who else is there? You've got Polly Toynbee. You've got Zoe Williams, you've got Simon Jenkins, John Harris, Seamus Milne. These are all seriously brilliant writers and seriously clever, pointy-headed people. And I think the feeling is just have someone who lightens the load a bit, and a bit of humour. So because the pages could get very heavy, and so that's the job I have. But I try within that to maybe make people smile a bit. Sometimes it's at someone's expense, but I hope to be able to make people think a bit, and just to kind of flag up. I think sometimes we forget the value of humour. I've written a lot about something that's close to my heart, Nick Griffin and the far right. I wrote a lot about the far right embarking, and I just mocked them mercilessly, because I think that there's a place for really serious coverage. And I think there's a place for just saying, these people are idiots. And luckily embarking, they were. I mean, they were just clowns, And when you've got, people who are... There was a guy who was, I think, the chair of he was the leader of the BNP group at Barking, and he talked about Queen and country, and we've got to support our boys. And they asked him to do a vote of thanks to the Royal Anglian Regiment because they were twinned with Barking Council, and he was too pissed to do it. It was marvellous for me. So not only are you undercutting him in terms of philosophy, but you're just taking the mickey out of him. And then later on in the election, I think, you know, as part of his law and order platform, he was videoed fighting in the street. Well, thank you God. Straight into the diary it goes, and so you then are able to fulfil that dual purpose of, say, of writing materials about a group I don't like that's damaging to them, but also just saying, these people are idiots. They're not only are they offensive, but they're stupid.
One of the other things we've talked about with some of the other people we've invited is this whole transformation that's going on at the moment in our business, you know, driven by the digital revolution. And it means that the industry is in a real state of flux, from the largest to the smallest content provider. It makes the sort of future look quite bleak for many students, although actually in a fragmented market, it could actually make points of access to begin with much greater. But in that space where we're supposed to be accurate, as you quite rightly pointed out, we're supposed to be reliable, even if it was with humour, there's a pressure, isn't there, to service a whole range of outlets, you know, online, obviously writing your column, your blogging, your podcasting, and even, I know you hate Twitter, but you've even got some people have to tweet mercilessly. Is there a danger that doing all those things puts pressure on us doing all the other things which the audience actually expects, which is accuracy, reliability?
It does, but you know, I find that all of the places I've worked at have taught me something. And this is where the BBC comes in. Because, you know, when I was on Newsroom South East, as it was then, in fact, just down the road, it was in Elstree, you know, I think we had 5 bulletins a day. And they were then experimenting with having all the correspondents work for radio as well. And I think there was a written element to it too. And so what I did, you do kind of learn how to keep all of the balls in the air and how to do that basic job of reporting, but then to exploit it in all of the different ways. And I think that that's basically what you're being asked to do. I think it would have been a bit more mind-blowing for me had I not gone through that experience of having to, you know, work at the BBC and do things quickly and do things you know, and hit different deadlines throughout the day and to do it in different ways for different people. And you said about the future being bleak. In a way, I understand why you're saying that, but I think it depends on your start point. I think for old gits like us, this is mind-blowing. And in terms of the scale of it, this is a bit like living through the Industrial Revolution. It's just everything is changing. I feel like a passenger on an airliner just going through turbulence, just buffeting you all over the place. And as soon as you think, oh well, I've got used to that, then you hit another bit of turbulence, and just thinking, when is this turbulence going to end? When it does end, everything is going to be completely different. I think our editor, because we're on tape, I will toady to my editor because he might get to see this. But Alan Rusbridger is completely into the digital revolution. But perhaps the most important thing that he tried to impress upon us all is that this is just not tinkering. This is the end of the world as we know it and the beginning of another one, which is why we've just been unashamed about it as saying we are now a digital-first newspaper. I think once you accept that there is that level of change, then in a way it's not so bewildering. I think if you're clinging on to the old world, then I think that's really difficult to do, and I think that is really bewildering because you can't, and you'll lose a bit of it every day, and you'll just become more and more desperate. So I think if you're going into the profession now, it is a profession where you tweet, you blog, you write, you podcast, you make a film. You know, it will just be natural. That's the job. Whereas for us, when I moved from the Telegraph to the BBC, there were people who thought I'd gone mad. How could you do that? How could you possibly make this change? Why would you want to? So in a way, I think if I had my time again, I'd think it was quite exciting, just going into this multidiscipline job.
I mean, you speak about this digital revolution. What about this increased importance given to citizen journalism? Do you think that is any danger for traditional journalists?
I think eventually, and it's beginning already, people will come to realise that there are standards that we all have to adhere to. And already, within the discussions about Leveson, even within the conservative version of it that was unveiled last week, they were talking about bringing the news websites under the ambit of regulation. I think the world is going to change. The first time a humble blogger libels someone and ends up in court and ends up having to sell their house to pay for a libel bill, I think people will realise that just because you can doesn't mean you should. And so to that extent, there will be a level playing field. But as long as there is a level playing field, then bring it on. Because I think that, you as long as it's good information and reliable information, you want as much information as you can, and you want to involve as many people as you can.
But how do you decide how reliable it is coming from the ordinary citizen?
Well, you have to check it. I take information from the ordinary citizen every day, and you check it. And you do various levels of checking, because some of them you will know are over a period of time you will know are reliable. Some of them will be more reliable than others because you know they're journalists and they may be working to a particular standard. Some of them, someone you've never heard of before, who's saying something that's pretty libelous, you'll check it and check it and check it. And so, in a way, you don't have the luxury always of wanting to just rely on what have hitherto been reliable sources of information. It's what you do with that information that becomes the important thing. Having said that, we'll libel someone tomorrow in the diary, and I will blame you.
To conclude, we'll keep the spotlight on The Guardian, but we'll ask something that I'm sure a lot of my fellow students are quite anxious to hear about.
This is the killer Paxton question coming now.
We all know the opportunities at The Guardian in terms of internships or trainee schemes are rather limited. What sort of advice do you have for us as young aspiring journalists in terms of getting a foot through the door?
My advice on is always you need to be completely persistent. You need to have ideas. You need to have ways to add value, because people might employ you because they like your face or they like your voice or because they think you're a jolly good chap or chapess. But most people have personal motives for what they do. If you're a news editor, you like the reporter who gives you material that means you can go in to see the editor and you don't get chewed off for having no material. If that person makes your day go easier because you didn't get told off by the editor that day, then you like that person. So if you as an aspiring journalist have ideas, and they're good ideas, and they are ideas that are relevant to the publication that you're targeting, pretty soon you'll break through. But it needs persistence. And I think that sometimes people underestimate how difficult it is, how persistent you have to be, that to get onto a national newspaper, there aren't many national newspapers, there are a lot of people who want to get on them. I keep using the phrase newspaper media organisations, but it's the Premier League. If you get in, you've done well. I always say that you need to maybe take on some of the characteristics of a stalker. I mean, try not to get yourself arrested, but you do need to be that tenacious. Try and develop personal contact with someone. Don't just be packaging up your idea and sending it to the news desk email queue. Whenever people get into our building, and a lot of people get through our building, I always say, well, make sure by the time you leave, you've met some people, you've got their numbers, you've got their emails, so you can then go direct to them and say, you know me, you met me, and this is an idea I've got. People will always be receptive to ideas. You can digitize our industry as much as you like. You can move away from a print mode of delivery to a screen-based mode of delivery, or an audio one, or a video one. And if you haven't got content, you might as well pack up and go home.
Questions from the floor? Let's have some questions from our audience. Unless Hugh, of course, has answered all your burning questions.
We'll send you all to sleep.
In which case we've done our job.
Marion.
Fascinating interview. Thank you, Hugh. I work in the business school in a marketing role. I want to say that you touched so perfectly on the paradox for me today, which is, on one hand, we have a narrowing of themes and ideas. And for me, the crunch issue that you raised was that a lot of people see it as it's about processing information rather than creating. And the word for me that's missing today is creativity. I'm interested in your comment, really, on much as the world is changing, which you did say, and it's changed forever, the one we once knew. Where is there still room for creativity, personality, individuality, and what impact has that got on the individual who wants the creative story rather than where the masses are going, as you commented on?
Content is king, and I think content will continue to be king. But it's about how we deal with the narrowing of the news agenda. I think what's happened, if you read, and I'm sure you have some of the old history books about journalism, some of the great newspapermen took the view that newspapers were there to tell ordinary people about a world they didn't know about, or to make the world understandable to ordinary people. And what it seems to me happened was that was really expensive and actually quite difficult. And so we then switched to, let's just tell people a bit more about things that they know about already. And you look at that, actually, it's not just in journalism, it's in various other forms of entertainment, it's in radio stations that play the same music because they know you like it already, so they give you more of it. In a way, what we sometimes do is the same version of that. Instead of saying, we take a risk here if we do this story because this is not just a variant of the story we did before. Let's do something completely new. I'm not sure we always have the courage to do that. And I think we need to I think that's where we need to go. I think we need to be more willing to bring in a completely different subject. I think we need to be more willing to have, we have a dreadful southern bias for a start. I think we need to be more willing to plunder the north for stories. I think that when last did you hear a story about, say, a mining village and how it recovered? One of the things we do with news is that we have a certain definition of what hard news is. One of the thought processes I had when we launched the Hideously Diverse column was I was quite influenced by American journalism, because it seems to me that some British journalists are really critical of American journalists. They say it's boring, but it seems to me that one of the things they do really well is they'll just go into a community and just write a piece about a community. And there'll be nothing that jumps out at you. There won't be kind of, and then Fred Smith committed an axe murder. It will just be an interesting piece about a place, an interesting, well-written piece. And that's the thing that we don't do that often. In a way, our journalism is more about crisis management. A big story will flare up and we'll run off somewhere. So we do things that are dramatic. Our journalism is very dramatic. But we're not so good at just things that are just interesting. And I think that's a bit of a shame. And I think if we were better able to do that, then the parameters we work to would be wider.
You spoke earlier about that, the duty of care that has been instilled early on in your career, and you also spoke about responsible journalism. Now, looking at the hacking inquiry and even the News Night Jimmy Savile case, it seems like that isn't there anymore. So, if it was there, what happened to it? Is there really a duty of care in journalism?
I don't think everyone always had it. I think that some organisations do that. Some editors do that. I mean, at the point I was called over and told you have a duty of care to this soldier, that was quite an unusual thing to happen, because you're much more often you just do your story and then you move on.
So you'd say that it should be further instilled and encouraged within a new wave of journalists, like the young journalists in this room right now.
I think it's good. I think good journalists care about what they're doing. Nick Davis was only able to break that story because he just believed in what he was doing and believed in the morality of, or the immorality of what he saw going on, that he kept going when everyone else was saying, you're mad and you're just wasting our time, or this is all wrong. So I think it is really good to believe in what you're doing. I think you have to have a certain level of humanity. And the best example I can give of that was Dunblane. Because I went to Dunblane for the Telegraph. And the first thing I remember about it, I never like it when all journalists are portrayed as being inhuman, because we all didn't like being there at all. But Dunblane was Dunblane. We had to be there and we had to do our jobs. And so part of that meant that there were a couple of days when you were knocking on doors and saying, your child was killed in this dreadful accident and this dreadful incident, and this must be awful, and is it less awful today than it was yesterday? And I mean, you end up asking questions that you just can't frame a question in those circumstances. It doesn't sound banal, but the country expects, and you have to write about it. And the extraordinary thing that happened there was, after about 4 or 5 days of this, the people there have been absolutely brilliant. And even people who are having their door knocked on 2 or 3 times. You sometimes find with door knocks in those cases that some people find it actually quite cathartic, as long as it's not some horrible hack knocking on the door saying, come out wherever you are. And after 3 or 4 days of this, people have been nice, but they said enough. And I think the local vicar gave an interview to the Press Association saying, everyone's had enough now. Can you go? And I don't quite remember how it happened, but there seemed to be some conversation that the news organisations had. And we all got the message, go. And so there was this extraordinary convoy of hire cars, because of course we'd all rushed down there with all hired cars at Aberdeen Airport. And there was just this morning when everyone who'd driven into Dunblane 3 or 4 days before drove out again. And I was actually quite proud of that day, because I just thought that, we were there, we had to be there, we had to do our job, but enough was enough, and leave people to just deal with this situation now.
Well, on that note of humane journalism, we can ask some more questions outside, but I want to thank Hugh for coming along and being as direct and as open and as honest as he always is, for giving us great insight and a real flavour of what it's like to be one of the best and brightest on Britain's national newspapers. Thanks, Hugh.